what I'm going to do today is take an institutional approach to today's talk, because basically what I'm most interested in is how institutions shape the behaviour of the people working with them and the groups that they form. I'm going to divide the presentation into 5 sections, and the first one is on party groups in the European Parliament. Then I want to talk about how the European Parliament elections work. I'll look at the results of the most recent elections held in May of this year, and how the right did and the groups that they've formed within the European Parliament. And then I want to look at the European People's Party, which is a centre-right party, and the pool that it's facing from the right. And I'll be covering the issue of Hungary's Viktor Orban's party, Fidesz. And also I want to look at an institutional power politics at play, which is the case of, now I've just always wanted to say this from the German, which is Spitzkandidaten, lead candidates. So I'm conscious of the time, and normally I'd encourage everyone to ask questions throughout, but if we could save them to the end, hopefully it means I won't have to go at triple speed and I should be done in half an hour. Fingers crossed. Okay, so within the European Parliament, members do not sit within their national groupings, but within political groups. These are organisations formed from relatively like-minded political parties and also independent members of the European Parliament, MEPs. In the current European Parliament, which is the 9th since 1979, there are 7 party groups, which is 1 less than from the last Parliament. Now, groups to form are required to set out their values and the main political objectives the members intend to pursue. They have to put out a declaration describing their common political orientation, and it has to be substantial, distinctive and genuine. And the reason for this requirement is to stop independence and people coming together to take advantage of the fact that there are benefits to being a party group and aligning themselves with no cohesive narrative to their alignment other than we want money. Okay. So some of these party groups exist only within the European Parliament itself, but others belong to an overarching political party. And these are transnational parties, made up of political parties from EU member states, and the membership can exist beyond the EU as well. Within the European Parliament, the party groups are roughly organised within the chamber according to their position on the political spectrum. So if you think of our House of Representatives, where you've got a government and opposition, the structure of the Parliament itself is different. It's called a hemicycle, and parties sit from left to right. It's a consensus-style parliamentary system, so a government isn't formed within it, in part also because the executive of the European Union actually sits outside the Parliament. There are financial incentives for forming a group. So Parliament's budget is distributed amongst the political groups, and that's mostly in proportion to the number of seats obtained by each group. Now, each political group is then provided with a secretariat from that budget, and the number and grades of those staff are determined by the size of the group. Non-attached members are also provided with support, but there are certain pots of money that they can't touch, including contractual staff, and they have less budget for things like information pamphlets, webmasters, seminar costs, travel costs, conferences, and that sort of thing. So financial incentive. The other incentive, though, is that as the Parliament doesn't hold the executive, the other interesting thing about the EU is that it doesn't actually formulate legislation either. That comes from the European Commission, which is basically like a bureaucracy. And so the Commission put forward proposals, and the Parliament tends to review these using the committees, its committee structure. So that's where the work of the Parliament is done. And I found, as an Australian, the easiest way to get my head around the whole function is to think of the European Parliament not as a lower house, but as an upper house, as a house of review, really, where they now have an increasing amount of power. Originally, they were only able to comment on legislation. Now they can veto certain things. So, but they don't initiate. So they do have 20 standing committees and 2 subcommittees, and obviously there are positions of leadership within those committees which are considered prestigious. Okay, so how do you get into the European Parliament? Every 5 years, elections are held, and the most recent were held in May, between the 23rd and the 26th. Now, that doesn't mean that polls were open in every country for 4 days. It just means that every country held an election between that 4-day period. Despite the fact that direct elections began in 1979, their method of election has never actually been uniform, and there are still significant differences at play. So one significant achievement is that all countries now use proportional representation to elect their members, but within that, 15 of the 28 member states apply a threshold, and that threshold isn't even. It ranges between 1.8% and 5%. 5 member states divide their electorate into a number of regional constituencies, but everybody else just runs their election using a single national constituency. Even though everybody is using proportional representation, they don't use the same format. So 7 countries use a closed list system where you vote for the party, not the candidate. And that's most like putting a 1 above the line in the old Senate voting. 2 countries, Ireland and Malta, as well as Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK for this process, use a single transferable vote where they can preference candidates regardless of parties. And then the remaining countries all use some form of open list where you can preference within a party's list. Other differences include the fact that the voting age isn't uniform. So most states are 18, but Austria is 16 and Greece is 17. And the minimum age for candidates to stand ranges from 18 to 25. So there are still a number of national influences on that election process. Okay, so there's currently 751 seats in the Parliament, and those seats are distributed amongst the member states based on population size. But there are thresholds, so there's a minimum of 6 seats required and a maximum of 96. Even with that distribution of seats, you still end up with significant malapportionment. So very small countries like Malta and Luxembourg have 1 MEP representing less than 100,000 people. But in France and Germany in particular, the representation is about 1 to 800,000. So that's still quite significant, giving WA a run for its money in malapportionment. So for many years, the European elections have been considered what they call second-order elections. And this is where voters use the election not to vote on European issues, but almost as a referendum or an opportunity to voice their level of approval for their national government. Now, there are arguments for and against that, and the best argument against that is to say there are plenty of people voting on European issues. Just look at the UK Independence Party, UKIP. All they're doing, though, is voting to get out of Europe. Alternatively, though, and I think an excellent example from the most recent election that was just held, is that in Greece, the ruling party, Syriza, which is a coalition of the radical left that became somewhat more populist over time, it fared so poorly that the Prime Minister was forced to call a snap election, and they promptly lost power to the centre-right New Democracy Party. So that did have significant national repercussions. Okay, so this focus on national rather than European issues is exacerbated by the fact that candidates run on tickets organised by their national party, rather than as a member of a European party, and we talked about those transnational parties, or within the party group. So I've got here an example of a UK ballot, and you can see, hopefully everyone can read, that at the top it's actually a regional ballot there. So the UK is one of those 5 countries that run on regions, and you can vote for Labor, the Conservatives, UKIP, the Lib Dems, rather than the party groups those MEPs sit in. Okay, I don't expect anyone to read this. I just wanted a quick, colourful visualisation to show how the whole process works. So in the inner circle, we have, this is the most current outcome, so the 9th Parliament. We have the party groups operating in the EP. In the middle, we have the countries that make up those MEPs, that the MEPs come from. And on the outside, we have the national political parties themselves. And if everybody can see, there are just a couple of things I wanted to show here. So when we look at, this is Renew Europe, they are the Liberal Democrat group. You can see that within France, there's a coalition of 3 political parties that form the French contingent of that party group. And then in the Greens EFA, European Free Alliance, you have a huge block from Germany, and 21 of those come from the Greens party in Germany. But there are also 4 or 5 individual MEPs there. So basically what I'm trying to say is that multiple domestic political parties can get together in either coalition or separately and be represented in a European party group, even though they're not running on the same ticket. Okay, now the other thing to note is that this is the first time since direct elections began that combine the EPP, which are your Christian Democrats, centre-right party, and S&D, which is your socialist Labour groups, don't have a majority. So traditionally what they've done is form what's called a grand coalition, where between the two of them, they're able to reach compromises and get their way within the parliament. But this is the first time that between the two of them, they don't make 50% plus one. So I just wanted to now talk about, well, what happened in the latest election result. And so we've talked about the fact that that grand coalition process didn't work. We know the fact that government isn't formed, but there were some significant changes that came around. So the first thing to look at is this little group in the black called the EFDD, Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy Group. And that was led by the UKIP people and also the Five Star Movement from Italy. That group disbanded and wasn't able to form again. So you can now see that there are, the non-aligned have jumped from 20 to, and now I can't read what that says, but I think it's 57. So there's a large number of non-aligned MEPs in the parliament at the moment. You've seen that the Greens have gone from 52 to 74. This is as a result of a strong performance in both Germany and in the UK. S&D, the Socialist Party, performed poorly in Germany and also in the UK. And the Liberal Democrats have jumped from 69 to 108, in part driven by a really strong performance in the UK. The EPP, now where did their falls come from? It wasn't from the UK because they don't actually live there anymore. They left in 2009. So let me go down further. The EPP lost some votes in part because ID, which is this group here, was renamed to Identity and Democracy, actually did very well in France and in Italy. And ID is your far right group. So Marine Le Pen's, they call themselves National Rally now, but it's still fundamentally the National Front. They actually won. They were the largest party in that election, and they won over 23% of the vote. And the Lega group, which goes back to Lega Nord, Salvini's group in Italy, also did particularly well. So that's why that particular group has jumped from 36 to 73, and we'll get into their performance a little bit more later on. ECR, which is the European Conservatives and Reformists group, a lot of that loss was from the UK, where the Tories made up 18 members and they're now down to 4. So in the UK, there was a swing to Brexit, and then the pro-European vote didn't go to Labour. It went to Renew Europe, and it went to the Greens. Now, take from that what you will, and whether or not Corbyn's a Eurosceptic at heart, but they were the results. Now, the next thing I want to look at is what the EP will look like if or when Brexit actually occurs. So I've got a little box at the top just showing where the distribution of the UK MEPs are at the moment. You can see they're only giving 10 to the Social Democrats, and this is from 74 seats, I think. But 17 to the Liberals, 11 to the Greens, only 4 Tories there, and then the large chunk independent from that Brexit party, where they won 30 seats. So what's going to happen if Brexit occurs is that the Parliament's seats are going to drop from 751 to 705. And 27 of the seats that the UK is giving up, as it were, are going to be redistributed within countries, again keeping to that minimum and maximum number, but 46 are being held back in case of EU expansion, because there are still a number of candidate countries, Turkey, which has been a candidate country for a very long time, Serbia, Montenegro, Forum, or whatever it's called now, and Albania as well, so they're possible countries. Okay, so we've seen that there are groups to the right. And the question then becomes, well, why don't they just form one mega right party? There are certainly financial and power incentives within the structure of the European Parliament to encourage that. So the right in the EP, and I'm going to basically say anyone to the centre, to the right of the centrist or the Liberals Renew Europe group, actually represent a very broad range of views. And some of that includes on the existence and the ongoing role of the EU itself. So there are three broad views on Europe. One is you support the EU and its continuation. The next view is that you curtail the role of the EU in everyday lives of citizens. And the third is that you withdraw entirely. On top of that, there are views on immigration and minority rights that differ significantly. There are also, which I think sometimes as an Australian you sort of forget about, but there are historical geopolitical factors that influence the way people behave, and I'll try and get to some of these as we talk about the groups themselves. But basically, the other issue is that it would mean for many national ruling and opposition parties that they, especially in Eastern Europe, who are quite antagonistic in the national parliamentary system, they would have to suddenly find themselves trying to work together in a quasi-political alliance. And so there are difficulties involved, and that's why you have so many right groups. And then the question then is, okay, well, exactly what do they stand for? And I want to work from far right to centre, if that makes sense. So we have this identity and democracy group, and so it's an attempt was made this time by Le Pen and Salvini to bring in all the other far right parties, and they wanted to be the third largest group in European Parliament. They ended up being fifth by not much. And they tried to court Brexit, the Brexit Party, and also a Spanish party called Vox, but neither of those two joined the group. They were able to pick up after an expulsion from the ECR, the Alternative for Germany group here. And I've tried to use the English translated names for all of these things, but sometimes then you'll talk about an acronym and it becomes AFD rather than AFG. But the Alternative for Germany group were in the Conservative ECR party group last time, and they were expelled for a couple of reasons. One of their members made some truly horrific comments about the treatment of migrants and the use of guns against women and children. That was then subsequently partially retracted and only used against women. Because we don't shoot children. But also they were starting to get a little cosy with the Russians, and that's a major problem for in the ECR, the Polish party group, who are the largest political party in there. So that's where that whole national geopolitical stuff comes in, because there's definitely a disconnect in the right in terms of their views on Russia. So Le Pen's group, the French and the Italians seem to be okay with the Russians and quite supportive of some of the policies that they have put in place, whereas the Scandinavians and Baltics have experience over a long term of dealing with Russians, and so obviously that colours their
close to Russia.
the threat is real, as it were. So that's one of the big differences, actually. Okay, so then before we get on to the next party, I just wanted to take a quick look at the non-aligned group, and you can see here that there's tiny little numbers of MEPs from all sorts of parties. So you've got the Communist Party of Greece, you've got the Party for Labour, Rule of Law and Animal Protection, but you also have Brexit up there, and then this five-star movement from Italy. I don't think I would actually call the five-star movement a party of the right. I think it's a protest party, and as a protest party, it was attracting people from everywhere, And so that's kind of why it's ended up in the non-aligned basket, because it doesn't have a cohesive narrative about a solution process, and that's why it attracted so many people, but it doesn't bring out what to do with it.
It's lost about half of the electorate anyway.
And they did have a big loss here, and you saw that movement went to Labour rather than anywhere else, and the alternative to that would obviously be going to the left or going to the centre-right. And in some respects, I'm slightly perturbed by the fact that I now call Forza Italia the centre-right. But yeah. Okay, so then we come to the European Conservatives and Reformists group. So these guys were founded in 2009 by the UK Conservatives, and you can see that they've still got their 4 people here, and this is where Vox ended up, and obviously the biggest party by far is that Law and Justice Party from Poland, who had the problems with the Alternative for Germany party and their Russian links. If Fidesz were to leave, I think this is where he would end up, because I still think he thinks of his party as much more conservative than far right. Regardless of the comments that he makes. Now these guys tend to call themselves European realists rather than anti-European. They're pretty pro-market and they want to stay in the European Union, but they think that there's been the social aspects of the laws of the European Union too much for them. So that's what they want to curtail back. All right, and then we come to the EPP group, and will it swing to the right or will it stay in the centre? So it's the largest group and has been since 1999. It has its basis in the Christian Democratic parties of Western Europe, and so it is dominated by the Germans. And if it hadn't been for Tangentopoli, it would be interesting to see if the Christian Democrats in Italy hadn't dissolved in the way they did through obscene amounts of scandal, how that process would be playing out, because I think that there are still repercussions in the electorate, as we've seen from Lega and Five Star and Forza Italia now being in the EPP. In the previous parliament, though, this group did have 216 members from all 28 member states. And before you ask, the reason it managed to have everyone represented was because 2 Tories jumped ship and they were pro-Europe, so they went back to the EPP in the last parliament. Right, and then we have our big distribution, and you can see exactly how many political parties are involved from the countries, and you can see that there are multiple representations of party groups in there. So we've got a Belgian here and here and here, and 2 Slovakians down here, and 2 from the Netherlands, plus there's another one up here. So big distributions of small political parties coming together, dominated by the Germans with 29 seats, and then you have the Polish People's Party and Civic Platform and some Polish independents who have come together, and they're bringing 17 seats. And then your next largest is a coalition between Fidesz and the Christian Democratic People's Party from Hungary, but that's a 12-to-1 distribution, so it's pretty much Fidesz there. Okay, so, I don't know if everyone can read those, but basically I just wanted to put some quotes up that I wasn't intending on reading about, well, what's the issue with Orban and what is he saying that's so problematic? In September of 2018, the European Parliament's Committee on Civil Liberties and Home Affairs put out a report that basically suggested that Fidesz was contravening Article 2 of the treaty. And that specifically they had 12 areas of concern, and amongst those were the functioning of the constitutional and electoral system, freedom of association, there's the rights of persons belonging to minorities, including Roma and Jews, and protection against hateful statements against such minorities, and the fundamental rights of migrants and asylum seekers and refugees. So as a result of this report, the EP voted to call on the European Council, the executive branch, to determine if a breach was occurring and whether or not sanctions should be taken out. The Council hasn't actually responded, but within that vote, what was interesting was that members of the EPP-PG were actually voting against Fidesz as well. So there are serious concerns, and here you see that Orban makes statements such as, we don't see these people as Muslim refugees, we see them as Muslim invaders. Of course it's not accepted, but the factual point is that all of the terrorists are basically migrants. considering what we've just heard about freedoms of minorities and the way they're viewed, this one's possibly my favourite. If you take masses of non-registered immigrants from the Middle East into your country, you're importing terrorism, crime, anti-Semitism and homophobia. Orbán is a really interesting guy because he's not a populist shoot from the hip kind of person. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's got a background in political science. Was actually, despite the fact that he's turned George Soros into this evil boogeyman, won a scholarship funded by Soros to go and study political science in Oxford, and then went back to run for parliamentary elections in Hungary. And he understands how political systems work, and he understands how to motivate people, and so what he's doing is, in some respects, so much more dangerous than what we see with a Hansenite figure, that sort of thing. So the interesting thing about him is that in 2014 he made this speech, and he says that what they're trying to do in Hungary is building an illiberal state, not a liberal state. So it doesn't deny the fundamental values of liberalism, such as freedom, and he could bring up a few more, but it does make this ideology, it doesn't make the ideology the central element of the state organisation. So he's coined this term illiberal state to describe where it is he wants the parties to go. Okay, so Fidesz's place within the EPP is questionable. So we talked before about the multinational parties and then the party groups. So in terms of the EPP as a transnational party group, that's made up of 80 parties and partners from 42 countries. So in February 2019, 13 of the European member parties wrote to the president of the EPP, Joseph Daul, requesting that Fidesz be expelled. And there was a catalyst for that, and that was a poster campaign in Hungary suggesting that the European Union Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, who is from Luxembourg, and himself a member of the EPP, let's not forget that bit, was supporting dangerous levels of migration and was a puppet of Soros. So at that point, they're basically sitting there saying, well, enough, you're pissing in your own party's tent now, so enough is enough, it's time, this is just, we can't do much about it. So on the 20th of March, the Political Assembly voted by a margin of 190 to 3 to suspend Fidesz, and Fidesz itself agreed to that and voted for it. What's going to happen, or what is happening now, is that they've got an evaluation committee, which are calling the Three Wise Men, to report as to whether or not Fidesz conforms to EP values. Now, while Fidesz was suspended from the EPP, that suspension did not go down into the parliament itself and the party group, in part because elections were being held, and so it still operates within the European Parliament party group. So at the EPP level, it can't attend any political meetings and it has no voting rights and things like that, but it's still operating as per normal within the European Parliament. Okay, which then brings us to the Commission. So we talked before about the fact that there's a perceived problem in that EP elections are actually held on national issues and not European issues. And one way to counter this is that the EP went to elections with these lead candidates who were nominated by party groups to act as the face of the campaign. So this is our person, and lo and behold, our person is the candidate for the commission role of president as well. So they first tried this in 2014, and there was a lot of argy-bargy, feelings of discomfort from the council, who normally nominate a candidate and then get the parliament's approval, but they felt that they were being railroaded by the parliament, saying, well, this is your choice of people, you would take one of ours. But the candidate was Juncker, former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, knew the people in the council, was considered a safe pair of hands, actually a decent candidate, so it went through, and this was a victory for the European Parliament. This time round, though, the EPP candidate was a guy named Manfred Weber, who's German. Now, Weber has state-level experience in Germany and is an EP stalwart, but doesn't have national-level experience. So the argument is, well, he doesn't really know how to deal with people at the council level because he hasn't been a prime minister or a minister in a government and things like that. There are also concerns about his English, and also that as a leader in the EPP party group, he's been an apologist for Fidesz for a long time because he's tried to keep them in the fold. Right, so during that suspension of Fidesz, Weber actually played a key role, to the point where Orbán's support of his candidature was in question, but at the time, Orbán said he would support them. Now, Weber made a few more comments, and in early May, Orbán withdrew support, basically saying that Weber's comments were offensive, he didn't need Hungarian votes, and it was an offence to Hungarian voters, so they weren't going to support his candidature, which put the whole Spitzenkandidaten issue into play. The other issue is that members of the council don't like being dictated to, and there's an argument that possibly misunderstanding the role of this process, Macron, the president of France, didn't think that anyone, thought that whichever party won the most votes, that person was automatically then going to become the commission president through the assent of the council. And the argument there is, well, no, it doesn't have to be the person who represents the party that won the most votes. It can be someone else who forms a coalition. So Weber was out, and at that point they moved to the representative of the Social Democrats, Timmermans. But at that point, one of Orbán's cabinet ministers put out a tweet basically saying that in our unity, the Visegrad Four, which is Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary, have again demonstrated our growing strength and influence over the direction of the EU. After defeating Weber, the V4 prime ministers have toppled Timmermans as well. So that means your two lead Spitzenkandidaten are out. And what do they do next? Well, there's a lot of toing and froing, and the compromise candidate is the German defence minister, Ursula, whose name I can continually forget. Von der Leyen. So she's been nominated by the council as the preferred candidate, but there's rumours that maybe not everyone in the parliament's thrilled about this idea, and the Germans may be leading the Social Democrats to vote against her. So then the question is, well, how does she get up, and where is that coalition to get the majority of votes going to come from? And will it come from the EPP with the S&D and the Liberal Democrats, or do they have to go to the right?
Never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment. Okay, so where does the EPP go from here? Well, we still need the Three Wise Men report to be handed down. And then the question is, well, they might be out of the EPP as a political party, but are they going to remain within the group? So in the tent or out, do the benefits of their membership for the group as a whole, is it enough to allow them to remain? Or, do you take a principled stance here on their position? Without the ability to form this grand coalition with the S&D, the EPP now needs to start looking at how they're going to be forming coalitions. And Orbán, very aware of this and has been making statements for a long time. I've just got an example of one here where he says, let's not tie ourselves to the left, let's find another path, cooperation with Europe's political right. So I think that fundamentally this is a watershed moment for the EPP group as it determines where it sits within the political spectrum, what its values are, and where it looks for support for forming coalitions. So that's it.
Well done.